Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and it's a very impressive group of people. I want to start off by saying that this is a hard conversation. I mean, I'm not going to mince words. We don't have time for it. And I think this dialogue should begin now, since it hasn't done so for a very long time. 10 years ago, I delivered a speech in Belgium on the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I looked back at it to consider what has happened with the passage of time. Then I duly noted that I enumerated the treaties that had been drafted, the numbers of ratifications, the domestic constitutions and jurisprudence which had been influenced, the individual complaint schemes that had been created by the treaties. The stock critique was the pervasive gap between standards and their implementation. I worried about a reversal of the decades-long trend towards universal norms, troubling signs of moral and cultural relativism, and a lack of political will among democratic states to stand together against emerging pressures on the system which were applied by the enemies of freedom. 10 years later, these criticisms seem minor, and the worries became, in my mind, full-fledged nightmares. Relativism is now the bread and butter of a global human rights system, gutted of its moral authority. The violators of human rights have taken sustenance from the weakness of democracies that have proved unable to withstand the challenges mounted in the name of cultural and religious sensitivities. In the past week, we have witnessed exactly why these failures are not just the hours lost in what passes for dialogue in the back rooms of the United Nations. Make no mistake, events in Mumbai are intimately connected with an international human rights system bereft of a moral compass. The alleged aggrieved, manufacturing their own victimhood, roamed the globe, murdering a 13-year-old American girl with a gunshot to the head, killing young parents in front of their 2-year-old child left sitting in her mother's blood, seeking out, brutally torturing and killing Jews while screaming Allah Akbar, or God is great. And yet in the halls of the United Nations, the guiding principle is that there is no link between terrorism and any religion, culture, group, or nation. How did the international human rights world move from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to human rights that kill? With the end of the Cold War, many anticipated that the negative role played by communism in the effective protection of human rights would be replaced by a new world order, characterized by vigorous and collaborative efforts to prevent human rights violations. The tension in the UN Charter between peace and security, or non-interference in domestic jurisdiction and protection of human rights, would dissolve. The competition between economic, social, and cultural rights on the one hand and civil and political rights on the other would be resolved. A common agenda to improve the welfare of individuals everywhere would emerge. As we know, it didn't happen. UN resolutions galore claim that all human rights are now interdependent and indivisible, and no hierarchy exists between the right to food and the right to vote, between the right to shelter and the right to free speech. Despite the verbiage, however, East-West tension metastasized into a North-South divide. The separation is said to be driven by the rich who exploit the poor, greed-driven capitalists who grab natural resources from the weak, and former colonial masters who still yearn for domination. While efforts to alter this dynamic through development aid and more sophisticated partnerships continue, dictators and tyrants fuel the sense of grievance in an ongoing attempt to divert attention from their own misdeeds. But so far, one might think, well, these problems that have arisen are familiar and they're not lethal. What is different today is that the cauldron of historical failings by developed states, mistrust, and undemocratic holdouts among developing nations is being exploited to the full by the developing world's largest single bloc, the 56 members of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, or the OIC. The OIC's role in undermining the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms today cannot be overstated. Consider the following. First, the United Nations has no definition of terrorism. It is unable to agree on a comprehensive convention against terrorism, which has been in the works for years. The main UN response to the events of 9/11 and the lead UN body to combat terrorism is the Counter-Terrorism Committee, or the CTC. It's composed of the members of the Security Council wearing a different hat. To this day, the CTC has never named a single terrorist organization, or state sponsor of terrorism. In recent years, the Security Council routinely adopts a presidential statement condemning terrorist attacks. But when a Palestinian terrorist gunned down 8 young students at a Jewish school in Jerusalem this year, the Council could agree on no such statement. The reason for all this is that the Islamic bloc maintains that blowing up Americans and Israelis doesn't count as terrorism. The Arab Terrorism Convention and the Terrorism Convention of the Organization of the Islamic Conference define terrorism to exclude so-called armed struggle for liberation and self-determination. The Arab group this past September added a distinction between terrorism and an open-ended right to resist aggression. At the UN, therefore, there is a gentleman's agreement that all states can join consensus on denouncing terrorism in general and leave terrorism undefined, meaning different things to different people. So Pakistan, the frequent spokesperson for the OIC, consequently has no difficulty proclaiming, and I'm quoting, "The OIC reaffirms its strong condemnation of all acts and practices of terrorism and its conviction that terrorism could never be justified." Such a proclamation is literally meaningless and invariably followed by a reminder of the exemption clauses. The absence of a universally agreed upon definition of terrorism is not just a problem for lawyers and tired diplomats. It has a tangible effect of making the prosecution of the war to end terrorism that much more difficult by the absence of a clear identification of the enemy. The effort to derail our struggle to end terrorism is repeated across the UN human rights playing field. In 2006, the United Nations adopted the so-called Global Counterterrorism Strategy. It has 4 pillars of action. What was first? Not a definition of terrorism, but measures to address conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. The Arab group rightly described the message as twofold. Arab countries suffer the most from terrorism, I'm quoting them, and disrespect of religions and defamation of their symbols should be a crime, since such incitement for hate could lead to terrorism. Other factors said to lead to terrorism are poverty and unemployment. In other words, the terrorist becomes the victim, Western democracies the villain. And the root cause of terrorism, never mentioned, is unadulterated hate, intolerance, and anti-Semitism, forces which aren't addressed by fuzzy feelings for misunderstood hate-mongers. Similarly, each year, the UN prepares reports and adopts resolutions entitled "Protecting Human Rights While Countering Terrorism." The fog of war created in the halls of the UN places protecting human rights on one side and ending terrorism on the other, though terrorism itself violates a great many rights and freedoms, starting with the right to life. The UN Human Rights Council is the UN's lead human rights body. It replaced the discredited Human Rights Commission as Secretary General Kofi Annan's primary legacy of so-called reform. Membership rules for the Council shifted the balance of power from that on the Commission to better reflect the actual demographics of the General Assembly. All members but Israel of the UN are divided into 5 regional groups. Israel is deliberately excluded from the full membership in any regional group, despite the UN's charter and a promise of equality of all nations large and small. The African and Asian regional groups hold the majority of seats on the Council, and the Islamic bloc has a majority of seats in both the African and the Asian regional groups. This means that the OIC holds the balance of power in the very center of the UN human rights system. This has real-life implications. First, there is a formal agenda for every meeting of the UN's lead human rights body with less than a dozen items on it. One is reserved only for condemning Israel, and one is called Human Rights Issues of Concern for all other 191 UN states. 2. The Council has had 9 regular sessions which cover human rights in all countries, and 4 special sessions devoted only to alleged human rights violations by Israel. The Council has only 1 UN human rights investigator with a job description which has no term limit, the investigator on Israel. By comparison, the few other country investigators must be renewed frequently or not. In its short history of 2.5 years, the Council has refused to renew or continue investigations on 6 states with some of the worst human rights records on the planet: Belarus, Cuba, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Liberia, Iran, and Uzbekistan. More than 50% of all the resolutions and decisions adopted by the Council have been directed at condemning only Israel, 20% on Sudan, where there is ongoing genocide, and the remainder on only 5 of the other 190 UN states other than Sudan and Israel. At this year's General Assembly, dealing with the violations of human rights, there are 19 resolutions condemning Israel and 1 each on 5 other countries. In all of 2007, have a full year there, the UN human rights system condemned Israel more than any other state, twice as often as Sudan. Tied for 4th most condemned country for human rights abuse across the whole UN human rights network in 2007 was the United States and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In short, while Israel is front and center, the victims of human rights abuse from around the world are being shoved off stage. Israel is the classic diversionary tactic. 3. The best defense is said to be a good offense, and the Islamic bloc has perfected this strategy for decades. Hence was born the phenomenon now labeled Islamophobia. This is not a word intended to convey the quite wrong discrimination against individual Muslims, which does exist in some circumstances and in some states. Instead, it stands for the claim that there is a global campaign to harm all Muslims driven by evil Western democracies. It is the counterweight to anti-Semitism. It adopts in fact, in many examples I could give you, it adopts a parallel narrative to discrimination against Jews, historically. But Islamophobia is hyperbole, wild hyperbole, and Denmark knows that better than anyone. Egypt described the Danish cartoons as having gravely offended 1 billion Muslims worldwide. Hyping Islamophobia has become a central feature of today's human rights milieu. UN reports and resolutions on the subject now proliferate. Instead of improving human rights conditions, however, they manufacture grievances, and those grievances heighten racial and religious tensions in the world, as well as distorting priorities and the allocation of resources in the human rights system. 4. The allegation of Islamophobia is supplemented by the battle cry of the defamation of religions. Who is defamed? Religion. Who monitors, assesses allegations, and identifies offenders? States. Self-anointed guardians of religion, the Islamic religion in particular, because the only religion named in the resolution on defamation of religions is Islam. Defamation of religions has nothing to do with human rights. As the Canadian representative told the General Assembly, Canada rejects the basic premise that religions have rights. Human rights belong to human beings. The focus should not be on protecting religions, but rather on protecting the rights of the adherents of religions, including of people belonging to religious minorities, or people who may choose to change their religion or not to practice religion at all. And yet the General Assembly has just adopted, over the objections of all Western democracies, another resolution on combating defamation of religions. The hypocrisy is self-evident. The countries screaming to protect freedom of religion the loudest are the same ones who render apostasy, or changing one's religion, a crime punishable by death. 5. Not surprisingly, the main authority figures on Islamophobia, all of which are non-democracies, say the solution to the phenomenon lies in gutting essential rights and freedoms of democracy, in particular free speech. There is now a concerted effort to insert serious restraints on freedom of speech at both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. Last March, the Human Rights Council, over the objection of Western democracies again, challenged and succeeded in perverting the only resolution of freedom of expression by the UN human rights system. They insisted that the special investigator, who had the job of drawing attention to violations of free speech, now report on abusing free speech. It calls on her to report on instances in which the abuse of the right of freedom of expression constitutes an act of racial or religious discrimination. There is also a concerted effort, and I could talk about it later, to introduce a code of conduct for the media. The goal is to undermine human rights, not to protect them. 6. A particularly dangerous portrayal of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights vision is the false charge of racism leveled at Israel. The purpose is to demonize Israel, isolate and defeat it on the political battlefield, since the task has not been accomplished militarily, though not for lack of trying. The tactic is best known in the context of the UN's Durban Racism Conference, which took place in 2001 in Durban, South Africa, and ended 3 days before the attacks of 9/11. I was in both Durban and represented the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and then moved to New York, directly from Durban on September the 9th, 2001. The Durban Conference was a global platform for anti-Semitism. There were 2 parts, one a non-governmental forum and a governmental conference, both of which adopted final declarations. At the NGO forum, handouts purported to describe the benefits that would have been reaped by a victorious Hitler. There would be no Israel. The NGO document declared Israel to be an apartheid state, guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity that ought to be totally cut off from the rest of the world. And although there is much misinformation, mostly propagated by UN sources, most recently from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights herself, that the government conference was much better, I can assure you, being present, that the claim is an outright lie. Almost every mention of anti-Semitism was deleted in the sections of the final negotiated text, from sections where anti-Semitism would have had practical implications like training judges and public officials. And the ultimate deal reached was a trade-off to allow anti-Semitism and a mention of the Holocaust as having happened in exchange for labeling the Palestinians as victims of Israeli racism. Israel was the only country-specific mention of racism in the whole world. The United States and Israel walked out of the Durban Conference. Denmark, along with the rest of the European Union, stayed and joined consensus. Bear in mind the outrageousness of this charge. 1/5 of Israel's population is Arab, with more democratic rights and freedoms than in any Arab state. Arab states, by contrast, are essentially Judenrein, almost 1 million Jews having been forced to flee since the creation of the State of Israel. The presence of Jews in Arab-claimed land are called in UN human rights resolutions the crime of Judaization. And yet nowhere in the UN human rights system does one ever hear of the complaint of apartheid Palestine. Since 2001, the UN human rights system has made the Durban Declaration the centerpiece of all its anti-racism operations, and in the last 2 years has been planning a follow-up conference known as Durban II, though it will take place, because it's called a Durban Review Conference, though it will take place in Geneva in April 2009. Canada has declared in January 2008 it will not attend. The United States voted against the entire UN 2008-09 budget, on the grounds that it contained funding for Durban II. Israel's Foreign Minister Livni has said and repeated a couple of weeks ago that Israel will not attend. The U.S. has not been participating in any of the planning meetings, but the decision about whether or not to attend the conference is awaiting President-elect Obama. Durban II has an agreed-upon agenda. Its purpose includes the implementation of the Durban I Declaration. That means that condemnation of allegedly racist Israel will of necessity be reconfirmed and supported at Durban II, at a minimum. Beyond that, the current draft text, subject to further negotiation, accuses Israel of apartheid and crimes against humanity, and no other state is targeted. The political purpose of this manipulation of human rights, and the racism charge in particular, is unmistakable. Last week, the UN held its annual Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. It marks the UN's General Assembly vote on November 29, 1947, to create two states, an Arab and a Jewish state, a deal which was accepted by the Jews and rejected by the Arabs. But instead of celebrating the first enunciation of a two-state solution, the day is referred to as al-Nakba, a catastrophe, from which at least 5 million Palestinians have a right of return, which would, of course, destroy the Jewishness of the Jewish state. To drive the point home, the UN flies only two flags at the front of the center of the conference room in the Trusteeship Council chamber, a Palestinian flag and a UN flag. The flag of the UN member state of Israel is literally nowhere to be seen. This year, the President of the General Assembly, after charging Israel with apartheid, which has never happened to the President himself, called for sanctions and divestment of a UN member state, to be meted out just like it was in South Africa. It is important to be clear about the odious nature of this racism charge because of where the UN came from. Its goal is to paint the victims of the Nazis as the neo-Nazis of the 21st century. On Palestinian Solidarity Day, there was a film screened before a public audience at UN headquarters, the only film shown, which included the following words: "Christians and Muslims alike unite in their hatred of Zionism. I preferred to die as a martyr rather than be governed by the Jews. The Jews yelled, 'Turn around, you bastards, you dogs.' They machine-gunned us, slaughtering us until morning." This is the language of human rights in 2008. This is what passes for human rights at the UN 60 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Built on the ashes of the Holocaust, the UN is now a global platform for anti-Semitism. This is not just a Jewish problem. Equality cannot be built on inequality towards the few. It poisons the anti-racism well. What can we do about it? I just have 3 short responses which we're happy to elaborate on. First, insist that the European Union fail to give legitimacy to the Durban Racism Conference by boycotting it, along with Israel and Canada. This is a battlefield of ideas for hearts and minds and definitions of rights and wrong, and we cannot afford to lose it. Second, recognize that there is no greater threat to human rights today than the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran, the leading state sponsor of terrorism, with a declared intention to commit genocide. And finally, the United States is not the enemy. If democracies do not stand together and denounce the assault that has been launched against human rights and fundamental freedoms in the name of Islam, an assault that has multiple prongs from excusing terrorism to using it, civilization as we know it will not prevail. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights attempted to chart a path towards human progress, but the realization of that goal is farther away today than at any point in the intervening 60 years. Thank you.
It is a great pleasure to be here in Copenhagen after having been now 6 months in Vienna, trying to establish or working on establishing a new human rights institution, a human rights institution of anno 2008. What we have heard about from Anne Bayefsky and what I, of course, also will talk about or you could say the human rights institutions, organizations of the 1950s. Do they meet the challenges of 2008, what the world look like today? Or do we need to see human rights in a different manner? And that's, of course, the heart of what Anne Bayefsky was talking about, and also what I will address. But let me start by just underlining that I think there are three things at stake here. First of all, do we want an international dialogue on human rights? Do we really want it? Question mark. Do we want international partnership on human rights? And what do we mean by international? Is that a dialogue where everybody take part, or is it just an exclusive club of member states, or of the states in the world, the approximately 200 states? I think it's very important when we discuss these issues, and some of you may have heard me say this before, so please bear with me. But I think it's very important to consider what has actually happened in the last 20 years in the human rights area. The human rights area has dramatically changed. Human rights discourse, the global discourse, has changed from what I would call an elitist human rights project, where human rights were primarily spoken about in Geneva, in Paris, in New York, in London, and a few other places. And now it has turned around and become a bottom-up dialogue, where human rights are being talked about with very many different voices in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Copenhagen, in Nairobi, in Washington, and across the world, in both capitals and further afield in more remote areas. I would claim that there's not a spot in this world today where human rights are not being talked about. What we have witnessed the last 20 years is a mushrooming of human rights NGOs working on human rights in their own country. We have seen national human rights institutions which do not talk about foreign countries, faraway places as we did in the old days. No, national human rights institutions together with civil society are talking about human rights at home, addressing the political level, the policy makers, addressing institutions at the national level, at the municipal level, at the very local level. How do you actually implement human rights, these international norms and standards? We have seen in recent years an increased engagement by the corporate sector. When we talked about the corporate sector and human rights 10 years ago, people were laughing. Today it's actually very much a reality that a number of the key actors, the key drivers in the corporate sector are seriously working on how to incorporate human rights into their corporate strategies. All this are developments which have taken place with a dramatic speed in the last 20 years approximately. Before, human rights was, as I said, an elitist project. It was very much a foreign policy issue, an issue about addressing human rights further afield than at home. And very often, the further away we saw human rights issues, the easier they were to be dealt with. When we saw racial discrimination in South Africa, everybody would recognize racial discrimination. The further it moved to our own borders, the further it moved into our own communities, these phenomena changed face, and they became social problems, or their problems. It became something different. That has changed. One of the driving forces were, of course, the democratization process, which started with the end of the Cold War. But I think there's more to it than that. I've thought about it, maybe we could have a discussion and later on. What is it really drives it? What is it that makes us see some other visions? Why is it that we start talking about homophobia today? We didn't talk about that 10 years ago. Why is it that we suddenly start addressing the rights of the mentally ill? We didn't do that 5 years ago to the same extent. What is it? Is it actually our moral imagination? Our moral imagination which helps us move it. We, so to say, see victims where we did not see victims before. They were victims, but we didn't see it. We didn't realize it. So to wind up on this development, you could, so to say, illustrate it by, as was said, we celebrate these years the 60 years anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. One of the big defenders in those days, that was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was driving the making of the Universal Declaration in 1948. She was, so to say, a key human rights defender of those days. Who would we give the prize today as a key human rights defender? I would not hesitate a moment to give it to the nurse in the hospital for mentally ill who really protect the rights of the most vulnerable in our society, or to the judge in Kenya who passed one of the first decisions on racial discrimination in Kenya in one of his local courts, or the persons working on human rights education in Vietnam. These are some of the local people really taking a big lead in developing human rights these years. All this said in order to illustrate that this is the new world that the UN bodies are going to speak into. What is the agenda? What sort of international mechanisms, if we want international mechanisms, what sort of international mechanisms do we need if this is this scenario, which is so different? Let me give you, as I said, my own institution, the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, there we are addressing these questions very serious and trying to build up a completely new sort of institution. That's not on the agenda here. Maybe I can come back another time and talk about that. But in the UN, we got the ICC, the International Criminal Court. It is remarkable that it took 50 years from the Nuremberg trials until we got the first permanent criminal court to address some of the most heinous crimes. We got an Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, again, a mechanism to address human rights on the ground, in the realities, where people live. So we're moving slowly in the human rights field in the UN system, but also at the regional level. From what I would say, we move from the Stone Age when it comes to mechanisms to something which is a bit more advanced. I hope that when we look back in 10 years' time, we'll say, interesting where we were in 2008. We have definitely progressed. We have got much stronger mechanisms. Let me give you one example from my time in the treaty body, as Jakob mentioned. I was member for 6 years of the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. When I came in there, in this committee, with 18 experts, and we had examined a few countries. Here, each country fly in, we examine them in depth, or examine them on how do they conform with the obligations that they have taken upon them when they ratified the convention. We spend a number of hours, read a lot of documents, and then we write conclusions and recommendations to the states. Here we are in the beginning of the 2000s. Very superficial. It was kind of like statements like the committee notes that racism is prevailing in the public administration. We urge the state party to address this phenomenon. What can you use that for in a capital? If the Danish Minister of Justice or Foreign Affairs receives such a recommendation, they say, fine, okay, but where should we begin? Where do we end? What do they think about? But in those days, the committee was not communicating with the capital, was not communicating with the member state. They were communicating to their colleagues, their friends in Third Committee in New York. Because the report from the treaty body was every year then sent to Third Committee, to the General Assembly, and then the General Assembly could sit and discuss these issues. They were not addressing the capital. Then in 2002, a number of us came in with the background in working specifically with human rights. And we started changing this, saying, listen, this is not right. We need to give much more guidance. What are the problems on racial discrimination? It's not prevailing in all parts of state institutions, but is it in particular one? Then let's mention it and also give some ideas as to how you can address it. After a few years, it was quite a battle in the committee and other committees as well, where similar developments took place in the beginning of this decade. One of the consequences of this was that suddenly the concluding observations, recommendations, became 3 times as long, much more specific, and member states started saying, interesting, this is really helpful. Another effect of this was a number of other procedures started being elaborated, follow-up procedures. So actually not only sending the concluding observations to the member state and ask them to react to it, but there was also a follow-up. So we had we see now a much more continuous dialogue between the treaty bodies, the UN treaty bodies, the monitoring mechanisms, and member states. And at the same time, involving national human rights institutions, they are being given, for example, in the Committee on Racial Discrimination, a formal role, so they can actually also interact directly with the treaty body members, as well as, of course, civil society can. So suddenly there's a much stronger dialogue between what happens in Geneva in the treaty bodies and what happens at the local level in Nairobi, in Egypt, in Morocco, or whatever countries we're talking about. There's still a long way to go, but this way of thinking has now also been more formalized, ingrained in some of the new UN conventions, the convention or the protocol to the Torture Convention, as well as the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, 2 very new instruments. And what has been created here for the first time is that in the convention it is said that state parties that ratify the convention, that they have to build an institution to address disability or to address torture. So again, focusing on what happens on the ground rather than the elitist circus at the international level. Of course, there are a number of problems still, very many problems linked to this system. There's not sufficient resources, and it still needs, of course, a lot of refining. It is in the very early days, but these are trends that we see and which are very much there. Then let's move to the Human Rights Council, to the political forum. And of course, one story to be told is the story that Anne Bayefsky tells. That's for sure. But there's also another story. There's a story that, yes, we got a new Human Rights Council. And there was a lot of optimism. We didn't like the Human Rights Commission, or some did not like the Human Rights Commission. I think it was overly criticized, and that could be a number of political reasons for why there was someone who wanted to kill the Human Rights Commission. That's another story. But anyhow, we got the Human Rights Council. I must say I think it was rather naive, those who thought that now we'll get a very strong, very powerful institution, because the states are the same. I mean, it was not that we changed the mechanism, then suddenly the states completely changed positions. No, I mean, it's the same states there. So it's not a very big surprise that a number of the discussions that we had in the Commission were transformed or carried over to the Human Rights Council. So that in itself was to be expected. But what is interesting is that, again, coming back to the changed work or the changed approach, human rights approach that we see, that much better possibilities for national human rights institutions, for civil society to interact and take part in the deliberations of the Human Rights Council. So there are many more voices. A lot of the discussions are live on the web, where people in Vietnam, other places around the world, Latin America, in the Arabic countries, can actually follow the discussions which take place. Much more transparency than we saw before. Then one very important feature, and again coming back to some of the issues that Anne Bayefsky mentioned, namely the whole issue of the country-specific resolutions. And it's right that the country-specific resolutions where specific countries are being targeted is being changed. Not that there's still, as Anne rightly says, that the number of very many resolutions against Israel, fewer against other countries. But what we got instead, and I'm not quite sure that it's entirely moving in the wrong direction, is that we got a general, what is called UPR, a universal periodic review. So now all countries are being examined. And there's, again, public examination. NGOs are participating, national institutions are participating, the discussions are being broadcast via the web in the states when they're being examined, etc. And again, what is interesting for me is how is this being used? How is this being received back home? And when I talk to some of the key actors, both some of the development actors, UNDP, UNICEF, some of the others, but also national institutions, civil society, then actually they use the recommendations from UPR to address much more openly some of the concerns back home. And that has again opened up for also using the treaty body recommendations, which are somewhat more focused, more substantial than what comes out of the UPR, which is, I must say, rather superficial. And I was very critical to the UPR, but in the first period. But I must say, the more I speak to people on the ground, what it's all about, in my view, the more I see there's a potential where the UPR can be used as a door opener into some national discussions which needs to take place. Because the change in the human rights field all starts with creating a language. If we still only speak our elitist language at the international level, and it's not rooted, it is not worth all that much. So therefore, creating the language at the local level, having some instruments like UPR, like treaty bodies, like national human rights institutions and civil society, to create that space, create those understandings, that is also what moves in the end the moral imagination in the Arabic countries, in other countries where we see gross and systematic human rights violations. It cannot be moved from the meeting rooms in Geneva alone. If I should wind up then with a few comments on the dialogue climate in Geneva. Then again, of course, very correct as Anne Bayefsky describes it. But there's one element that I think you missed, and not to address you directly, but it's already here in my notes. So, and that is, I think the Western group, you can say those that we normally recognize as the do-gooders in human rights. Okay. The Western group has not sufficiently realized these changes. I think the Western group is still far too much speaking into an old human rights agenda. They have not been able to renew the agenda. Whereas we have another group. We've heard about the OIC, but also further afield, which, thanks very much to the training that I'm sure Anne Bayefsky have taken part in, and I have taken part in, and a lot of people in this part of the world, training people around the world in human rights. These people are now finding their way into the foreign ministries. They are very well trained in human rights. They know what human rights are about. They know the UN procedures. They use the procedures. And they have an agenda. They have something they want to achieve, whether we like it or not, but they have an agenda. Whereas, I must say, I have very great difficulties in actually seeing what is the Western human rights agenda at the moment, except from saying no. We are very much in the defensive. Again, if we talk about Durban, yes, the Islamic countries are talking about the defamation of religion, and that has nothing to do with a human rights agenda. Human rights are not about religions or countries, it's about individuals, individual human beings and their rights. Full stop. And that should of course be reacted against. But it would be very nice if there were some other issue, something else that we wanted. And I think actually, and we have told and we have made papers, we have pushed, because I actually think Europe has an enormous amount to offer in a racial discrimination discourse. We have first of all to offer that we recognize that we have problems. Most regions do not recognize that they have problems on racial discrimination. I can talk about that from my examination of countries which are completely ignorant to actually, and we have to say, listen, these problems that you have in your country is actually racial discrimination. Right. And not at all a public discussion in these countries. But we have a very high level of recognition. We do not only have a high level of recognition, but we also try to do something. We could probably do much more, but we have the EU with the EU race directives creating specialized agencies in all the 27 EU member states. We have Council of Europe with ECRI. And I know there are a lot of people probably in here who do not like the reports from ECRI, do not like all this, but that is what human rights is about that we have guards, we have people, institutions at the national, regional, international level who speak out about these issues. Why don't we try to bring this to the table? Try to actually create some sort of policy, be proud of it and say, listen, this is what we have, this is what we want to achieve, and in policy terms we would phrase it like this. This would in many ways play very well into what we have done at the disability area, torture area. Why not try to bring that forward into the racism? And hopefully we can move much further than that. This could just be some of the first steps. So I very much hope that, let's say, within a meeting like this can be the beginning of, let's say, 10 years where we really focused in the Western world and with friends. Let's not make too much us and them. I mean, let's be careful. I mean, it is not the West here and the bloc out there. The West is divided, first of all. It's not a unit. We have the US sitting completely on the side. They are passive, not taking part. So for the moment, the West is Europe in these contexts. And there's a lot of diversity even within OIC, and of course also further afield in Africa, Latin America. So it is not a uniform bloc. It's definitely, there's room for new alliances. We just have to, so to say, open up the box, start the dialogue, and get new partnership. So let me wind up by saying that since 1948, a lot of progress has taken place. A lot of progress, we have achieved a much higher level of protection for individuals, for all of us, than we had in 1948. Very much thanks to the moral imagination which was triggered with this very document. We have moved on from 1990. The bar has been raised even further. And I would say from 2000, the bar has been further raised. We do see a progress in the level of human rights protection. Yes, there are enormous amount of problems. There are new problems coming up, but let's not completely be blinded by all the problems. Let's also every now and then step back and see that it actually works. Some of it works, and of course, then let's do more of what works and less of what does not work. We need to create new global partnerships. Thank you very much.
First of all, of course, there have been changes, and since in the last 60 years, and human rights protections have increased in some places. I would say however, that largely it's been despite the United Nations, not because of it. The question of whether we want dialogue, it's an important issue, because 2 weeks ago there was the Saudi Arabia sponsored the dialogue on religious freedom and so on at the United Nations. And there's a whole effort to fashion something called the Alliance of Civilizations. It's a cover, because it's a situation where dialogue has become an excuse, a vehicle for preventing, in fact, actual action to be taken against human rights abusers. And I think that that's what we're seeing more of it. There is a European perspective that it's all right that the Human Rights Council now not adopt any resolutions critical of specific countries, except, of course, for Israel. And I think that that's appalling, because we spent 40 years in the Human Rights Commission trying to get to the point where we could at least name abusers. We didn't have a standing army at the UN. We couldn't do much about sanctions were hard to come by, but at the very least, we could identify who the human rights violators were, and that had some important benefits. All of the countries wanted to avoid a resolution. They didn't want a special rapporteur appointed to investigate their human rights abuses, and it had some hope of shining the light of day. After all, that's how, and the likes of Amnesty International operate. The fundamental principle is that we have to identify villains, and or otherwise that we have no hope of improving them. So this is a net negative, not a positive. And anybody who tries to pretend that that's just terrific because we can all sit down and feel warm about each other, I think is just, I think the way of thinking is naive, because we can't prevent human rights abuses from a dialogue that's manipulated to be avoiding any finger pointing. If we have no sticks, at least in terms of pointing to villains, we won't have improvement. Secondly, Denmark is having ratified many of the human rights treaties, is I think in a well position to ask how effective they are. The Racial Discrimination Convention allows for, if it's ratified, one of the articles, individual complaints of violations. What country has the most complaints of violations of racial discrimination in the world under CERD? And it's Denmark. Do you really think that you're the world's worst human rights violator in terms of racism? I mean, the number one country for the most human rights violations in terms of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is Canada. The Algeria, to my knowledge, ratified the CERD convention. There are no complaints to CERD under the case of Algeria. So, in fact, I've added up all the individuals in all the countries that that have been given a formal right by their countries to complain of human rights violations under one of the treaty bodies. 1.5 billion people. Do you know how many cases the UN gets in a single year from those 1.5 billion people who could complain on everything from discrimination on any ground to right to vote, elections, and all the rest of it? 200 cases a year, mostly less than 200 cases a year, from 1.5 billion people. It's because, now there are other problems with it. They don't have access, they're not educated, but many of them are afraid. Now, I couldn't agree with you more about the point is that the point of human rights is really to get down out of the realm of the international agenda and all of the politicking to real people with real problems. And insofar as the focus of attention becomes national institutions and an incorporation of a dialogue with civil society within the nation state, that's really where the focus of the benefits of human rights have to come. And I simply agree with you totally on that. The trouble is that the world's international human rights organizations, the INGOs, as they're called. We don't know who they are. You know, it's an interesting, some people call it a kind of a, you know, they've become they're sort of heads of state in their own way. You know, they're invited to Davos. And they're not elected, and they're not accountable, and they have enormous budgets. Human Rights Watch is a $40 million annual year budget. Amnesty International is $100 million a year annual budget. These are some significant players, and who are they? And who sets their agenda? And do they really speak for civil society? I mean, it strikes me as enormously arrogant to say, you know, we represent civil society, especially in places, of course, where they don't have any democratic rights at all. The question about, I think the point about the United States being passive, I have to take that on. The United States is passive in the human rights world, in the international global world, for one reason in particular, in the UN context, and that's because anything the United States touches, if it co-sponsors a resolution, is the kiss of death. It has to work through the European Union, who likes that just fine. Because the European Union becomes the kingmaker, the power broker, and the United States is shoved aside because it cannot participate fully, because if it does, then you can be damn sure your resolution isn't going to get adopted. So you don't want a U.S. co-sponsorship until the very end. And you certainly don't want the ambassador to start talking in favor of your resolution, because you can forget about your alliances from parts of the developing world. So that's unfortunate when the United States becomes, you know, the problem in the human rights world. Are there problems in the U.S.? Of course there are. But is it fourth most demonized place along with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or have we sort of somehow skewed the human rights dialogue? I guess my answer to that is obvious. The Western group, and also a very other important point, the WEOG, Western European and Others group, the WEOG group, agenda is just saying no. I couldn't disagree with you more. I was on the Canadian delegation to the Human Rights Commission and the General Assembly in different parts. I went to, for example, Beijing with the American Society of International Law, Women's Conference, World Conference, and so on. There are enormous efforts to put on the agenda non-discrimination on women, violence against women, freedom of speech, and disability rights, as you rightly mentioned, and so on. Constant efforts to put interesting progressive things on the agenda, but they don't succeed. I mean, the battle over sexual orientation is obscene. I mean, I just watched it last week in the Third Committee of the General Assembly, and you know, Egypt saying it has nothing to do with human rights, and in this particular case, in fact, it was adopted. It stayed on the agenda, but it's a constant uphill battle, and the West, which I know is not a very good way. It's not just West. It obviously includes democracies in other parts of the world, other than geographical West, but I think there is an effort to move, to push the envelope, to make progress in emerging human rights areas, and we are creative, and we don't want to be just on the defensive. But the fact that we're put on the defensive is the problem, and it's a very interesting one which you raise, because human rights really has become a weapon. So you're right that it puts us on the defensive, because the accusations, the wild accusations of human rights violations for countries which have problems, you know, Canada's not perfect. Obviously, the United States has problems. There are problems with Aboriginal people, with Guantanamo, with you know, you can mention a whole series of problems, but they pale by comparison to the million female migrant workers in Saudi Arabia who get their passports taken away when they enter the country and are slaves. Or Sudan, which has cross amputation in the criminal code, because you can cut off right hand and left foot, which I could never figure out why they did that until I found out that they do that, so people can never walk again because they can't hold a crutch. So or Iran, where the president-elect of the United States wants to sit down with a dialogue with Iran to talk about the efficacy of dialogue, with a criminal code in there, not just a criminal code, but the practice of burying women to their waist naked and stoning them to death for alleged adultery. So at what point in time do you say, you know what, I don't have anything to talk to you about, you're wrong, and the human rights requires that I adopt sanctions, that I take serious action to prevent you from butchering the people in your own backyard. That's what international human rights are supposed to accomplish. True, I think you're right that the action has to go on at the national level because of the failures of the international community. But in theory, we were supposed to stop genocide in Sudan. We were supposed to care about what's happening in the places with the world's worst human rights situations. And that's what, of course, responsibility to protect is all about. We were waiting to see how far that's in fact invoked, because you can be sure if the United States takes seriously a responsibility to protect idea with its new government, the first people who are going to be complaining about it are the very developing countries, and also undoubtedly the European Union, because it'll be too expensive and it'll be too interfering, and they don't really want to stop genocide here and there. In other words, the complaints that will be lodged against the United States for taking responsibility to protect seriously will be enormous. So, people want it both ways. They both want intervention, and yet if it happens, it's colonialism. So, I think that we're in a very difficult time where we expect a lot. Maybe that's from our human having developed a normative system over 60 years. We expect a lot of it, and it simply has failed in the most fundamental way. And I suppose I haven't spoken very much about Sudan, but I mean, isn't it the obvious example of how failed it has been? We created an international criminal court. Very interesting, the first public prosecution of the president, sitting president, an enormously important development which one shouldn't underestimate. But can a criminal prosecution, stop the 2 million refugees in neighboring countries, the systemic rape and the ongoing genocide in Sudan? I don't think so. The United States is the only country that has called what's going on in Sudan genocide. The United Nations refuses to call what's happening in Sudan genocide, and it won't use the word for fear of it invoking the Genocide Convention with responsibilities for all kinds of states. So I know this isn't a very coherent way of ending, but I would say that Sudan is just an enormous failure of the UN human rights system, which of course was created on the basis of never again. Thanks.
A few comments. First of all, let me make it absolutely clear that I'm absolutely along the line on Sudan and the failure of the international community. That plays into what I said, that we are moving from the Stone Age and maybe a little bit further when it comes to international mechanisms to address some of these most heinous crimes, both in stopping them and dealing with them after they have taken place. So that goes without saying, but that was also before the OIC got all organized, etc., etc. I mean, it has been a very long, slow move to actually increase the muscles of the international machinery to deal with cases like Sudan and other crimes against humanity. You made an interesting point here that I think I got you right when you said that you agreed that things should happen at the national level because of the failure of the international machinery. And this is maybe one of the areas where where we would disagree, because I would say this is not an either-or. And that is maybe the mistake that we made, that we thought that we could solve all the problems in the world by passing resolutions in the General Assembly and in the Human Rights Commission and Council, then things would just happen. Or if there was an examination in a treaty body. Where what we are now developing is that we need both. We need both the international machinery and we need developments on the ground. And not least, we need a very strong interaction between the local level or the national level and the international and regional machineries. Because this is where things suddenly become meaningful, that what happens up here at the international level is brought down and actually seriously by different mechanisms at the national level try to be implemented, and issues, real human rights issues, concerns, are being brought from the local level to the international level to be addressed, to create a platform for the national actors to work on. I'll give you one example because this may be a bit abstract. In 1990, there were 5 national human rights institutions in the world. 5. Denmark was one of them. Canada, another one. Today, there are more than 100. So in more than 100 countries today, within a period of approximately 15 years, we have got these strong institutions at the national level to deal with human rights domestically. That development is an explosion, would never have taken place if it had not been because of the Human Rights Commission, which had an annual resolution which pushed state to establish them, created a framework for the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to fertilize, create a room where the national institutions could meet, could develop strategies on how to, so to say, create new institutions. So there was a tremendous interaction between the very local level and the very high level in the then Human Rights Commission. And that then continued, and the National Human Rights Institutions got a very prominent position in the new Human Rights Council as well. So these are some of these mechanisms. So it's not because of the failure of the international level. I would turn it around and say that what is being achieved and what is being moved at the national level is to some extent thanks to the framework which is offered by the Commission, or the Council, the Office of the High Commissioner, regional bodies, and others. And of course, in this area, it's always very difficult to say exactly it was this institution which made it, because there are so many different actors, but what we can see is that things are moving ahead, and there are some of these resolutions, conventions, etc., which actually play a very crucial role in moving this agenda. I would hate not to have this forum. Then the whole issue of dialogue. The dialogue is a fake. We don't need dialogue. Again, I must say, I think some of the biggest changes that we have seen, for example, in China, is not because of the naming and shaming by states or by the Human Rights Council. I think that some of the human rights dialogues which have taken place, the EU-China human rights dialogue and the others, where you really can enter into the substance and where you do not immediately push your counterpart in the defensive, but where you actually in an open dialogue start opening their minds and they see that things actually can change without, you could say, the great catastrophes that all states are, of course, afraid of. Again, an example. It's very easy to sit in a meeting room and pass resolutions on stop torture. I would guess in this room we are all against torture and support the absolute prohibition of torture. But when that is said, it is very difficult for any country to stop torture from the one day to the next. What do you do with a completely unskilled police force? I mean, they have absolutely no training, and there's political pressure, there's a pressure of society. We want crimes to be solved. So what do? You beat the hell out of this person that you think it is until he confesses. That happens in so many countries around the world. You cannot change that from the one day to the next. And everybody knows it if you've been on the ground dealing with the police and actually seeing some of these situations. So of course you should insist on an absolute prohibition against torture, and then we should enter into a dialogue, a focused dialogue. How do we do it? What are the steps that needs to be taken in order to actually change the situation? If we could change racism just by passing a global convention against racism, we have now talked racism for 60 years, and it's still prevailing as a worldwide phenomenon. We need to be much more focused on how and get, so to say, the technicalities right. And that is what happens in the dialogues, in the China dialogues, in the Arab dialogues, that there is a lot of trust building that needs to be developed. There's a lot of room and common language that needs to be developed. It's true that it's only a handful of countries which have actually some handful of countries which have made it possible for their citizens to complain to the treaty bodies. One of the countries is Denmark, and here there are some lawyers and NGOs using it. I think that's great. And a lot of people, NGOs and others, are pushing around the world for making, first of all, the countries make it possible that they can complain to these bodies, and secondly, also make people aware of it, that they have these rights. And they can. So there is, of course, an imbalance, and the number of cases doesn't indicate anything, but maybe only that there are active lawyers and NGOs bringing cases forward. So let me just then. I must say, I uphold my position that I think the West should be more proactive. You mentioned disability. I must say the big mover on disability was not the Western group, that was Mexico. Mexico was the one, and together with a number of other countries, actually a number of European countries were very reluctant in the beginning, but when they saw the train moving, they got on board and played a very constructive role. But those setting the agenda, that was Mexico together with some other countries. The resolution on indigenous people, I think Canada, Australia, countries with big challenges, as you rightly said, in relation to indigenous people, voted against a resolution. A number of European countries, including Denmark, voted in favor of this resolution. So I would uphold the position that I think that we still need some more clear vision, some more ideas, a stronger human rights agenda. And I think this has been so far very interesting.